Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Northumberland Learning Connection's presentation tonight on Truth and Reconciliation with Indigenous Peoples, featuring Dr. David MacDonald as our guest speaker and Chief Dave Mowat, Chief of the Alderville First Nation, as our moderator. I'm Paul Macklin, and I'm Vice Chair of Northumberland Learning Connection, and I am pleased to welcome you to this special event on the evening before the National Truth and Reconciliation Day. Before we begin tonight's program, let us pause to reflect on our local heritage with a land acknowledgement. I respectfully acknowledge that Northumberland County, where we are tonight, is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. This territory has been inhabited and cared for from the beginning by Indigenous peoples and is covered by the Williams Treaties. As well tonight, we are particularly happy to acknowledge our sponsor for this evening, Lynn Hardy of RBC Dominion Securities Wealth Management. Let's give Lynn a big hand for providing the support for this evening. Thank you, Lynn. And at this time, I'd like to invite Chief Dave Mowat, Chief of the Alderville First Nation, to bring greetings.
Miigwech Paul. Anin Bojo, Ogimao Dave Mowat, Indigenous Cause, Aldervilling, and Dunjaba. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I was asked by Dorothy, actually I got a call from Dorothy, and she was a little concerned about who would moderate tonight. I said, well, I can moderate this. And I'm very happy to be here. So I bring greetings from Alderville First Nation on this important eve of a very important day tomorrow. And so I'm looking very forward to hearing Professor MacDonald and entertaining the discussion as we move forward. So, Chimigwech.
Just to give you a little bit of layout of how the evening is going to work, we're going to begin with a presentation from Dr. David MacDonald. We'll follow it with a moderated discussion between the Chief and David, or Professor MacDonald. And as we conclude, we will take questions from the audience, so please do think about what question you'd love to ask and have it ready. Dr. David MacDonald is a full professor from the University of Guelph. David came to us from originally from the Treaty 4 lands in Regina, Saskatchewan, but has focused his work on comparative Indigenous politics in Canada, New Zealand, and in the United States. In New Zealand, he worked with the Maori as an Indigenous people, and he had quite a different expectation or experience rather than what he had in Canada. He's the author of 4 books. He's widely published in the Globe and Mail, National Post, Winnipeg Free Press. He's truly a man of excellence. He obtained his doctorate from the London School of Economics in International Relations and Comparative Politics. This evening, he will provide us with an opening presentation on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 7 years later, Settlers and Conciliation with Indigenous Peoples. And if you're curious about David and more so, there will be books available downstairs for purchase by Furby House Books, and I believe that Dr. MacDonald will go down and be prepared to sign those books. So right after the event. So let's now turn our thoughts to our guest speaker for this evening. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. David MacDonald.
Thanks very much, thank you. Wow, a man of excellence. Now I'm tempted not to say anything so that that great description can linger for a while, but I am conscious of the time, so I'm not going to do that. So I'm David MacDonald. Really happy to be here today, and also to see many of the orange shirts in the audience, which I think is awesome. So I'm going to take you through a bit of a presentation. The book that I wrote, the one that's for sale, looks at the issue of genocide in Canada. But not just Canada, but also to a certain extent in other countries as well. I worked briefly for the TRC as an academic consultant, and I'm also involved with the work of a Royal Commission in New Zealand called the Royal Commission on Abuse and Care, which is actually looking at the removal of Indigenous children from their homes and communities as well. In the 1990s, Australia had a similar Royal Commission, also looking at the removal of Indigenous children as well. And what's interesting is that there's very similar patterns across all of what we might call the Western settler states or the Kansas states, which is sort of in the background of this, because when we talk about things like settler colonialism, it's not just about Canada or the US or individual countries. It's about a network of processes and practices and things like that. Now, I don't know how much all of you know about residential schools and the Genocide Convention and different things, and I can't really see you very well, but what I may do is if there's a whole lot of stuff on the residential schools, and I think you probably know it already, I'll try to kind of skip through it a little bit more quickly so that we can move on to some other things. I'll also put out some different points of contention, which I hope will provoke some discussion and questions later on. So hopefully that will be interesting and get you engaged with some of the topics that we'll be looking at. So I was raised in Treaty 4 lands. My slightly swarthy complexion is as a result of my mom, who you can see here, who's from Trinidad. And that side of the family were brought in as indentured laborers in the 1850s and spent a lot of time cutting sugarcane for the British. And apparently they were pretty good at it, but I don't imagine it was very fun. And so I was raised in Regina, and we lived pretty well. There was a small Caribbean community in that city. There were large Indigenous populations in the city as well, and many of my Indigenous friends, strangely enough, growing up, were all adopted by white families, which just seemed to be the way it was at that time. And there were other things that just seemed to be normalized, which I always found kind of strange, that most of the Indigenous peoples in Regina didn't seem to have as much money or live as well as the white settler or the Caribbean settler population, for that matter. And so there was very much a sense that Indigenous peoples were underclass, third-class citizens in a city which, on their own lands. And it didn't really make any sense to me, but I didn't think too much about it because you get normalized into thinking a certain way when you're raised in a place. When the TRC came out and when all of this discussion of residential schools and the 60s scoop developed, I began to put pieces together. And for me, the release of all these truths was something that was, I think, quite cathartic because it started to explain the status quo in ways that I hadn't really understood before. And that became a bit of a driver of some of the work that I began to do. So my focus tonight is going to be looking at this issue of conciliation. I'll tell you why I'm choosing the word conciliation, not reconciliation. And then I want to look at what is the topic of the book, which is looking at genocide. And what does it mean in Canada? There are people that say, no, it's not genocide. Other people say that it is. There was an active debate on my work in a number of publications. My former good friend, the historian James R. Miller, we are no longer really friends because of this genocide issue. Although we agree pretty much on all the same facts of the residential schools, the so-called G word is something that is anathema to him and to many other sort of older historians who have been working in this area for a very long time. Also, how are the residential schools genocidal? I'm going to look at that as well. And then we'll look at some other issues like what does it mean to recognize genocide? What does that actually mean? And can you deny something that not everybody accepts as necessarily being the truth? So I want to kind of look at that as well, especially on a day that we're going to be looking at truth and reconciliation, and then a few recommendations. So let's get started. Why only the term conciliation? I would say first that we do have a lot of myths as Canadians that things were pretty good at some mythical past time between the early settlers or the early explorers and Indigenous peoples. But that's not necessarily always true, and I think there are some rosy mythologies that have developed over time which don't really tell us the full story about what things were like during these earlier periods of what is now Canadian history. Heidi Stark, who's a well-known Indigenous theorist, talks a lot about reconciliation needing to develop between Indigenous families, between Indigenous communities, and between Indigenous peoples, and the lands, the animals, the waters, everything around them that colonization affected to sever. And my colleague at the University of Manitoba, Keir Ladner, talks a great deal about reconciliation as not a great big hug. Instead, she says it requires settler society, which is our society, to acknowledge and accept some really uncomfortable truths about how they acquired their or our privileges. It requires settler society to cede the privilege it has denied to Indigenous peoples. And so that is perhaps an unsettling statement to make, and it's something that we'll probably look at more during the discussion. So in the book I develop, which came out in 2019, and was the result of my work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I had a contract to write a report looking at whether the Genocide Convention applied to the residential schools. And I said that it did, and I had been writing on this topic for a while. There's two basic ways I guess we could understand genocide. And how many of you are familiar with the Genocide Convention and the term genocide? Maybe just put up your hand if you are. How many of you don't know anything about it, or very little? Okay, a few of you. Okay, all right, so this is good. Okay, so the term genocide was invented in 1944 by a Polish Jewish jurist called Raphael Lemkin. And he would write a book called Axis, Rule in Occupied Europe. And the point of the Genocide Convention for Lemkin was that individual murder was homicide, but the murder of collective groups could do a much greater disservice to humanity. And he had and this is just a quote from Axis Rule, but this idea that our whole heritage is a product of the contributions of all people, and that we don't know where the next great thing is going to come from, where the next great movement, the next great music, the next great literature, anything is going to come from. And it's very important to keep all of these cultures together and try to preserve them. So the destruction of culture was central to what Lemkin was trying to look at. In 1948, we have a convention passed which outlines 5 different ways that genocide can be committed under international law. And what I've looked at in my research is the E, which is the bottom one, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And that's what I say in the book, that the argument can be made that the taking of children from their communities to these residential schools, and also the 60s scoop, which was the taking of children from their families and communities to be adopted out, often in white homes, often in American homes, could also be seen to violate the convention as well. So the term legalism means genocide, and understanding of genocide that relies on the United Nations Convention. It also builds on a lot of older work that has been done looking at the Genocide Convention in different Indigenous contexts. In fact, the Assembly of First Nations in 2002 at that point officially recognized the residential schools as violating the Genocide Convention. And Chief Roseanne Archibald last year also talked about genocide as well, especially during the uncovering or the revealing to the public of many of the graves in the cemeteries of the former residential schools. Canada recognizes 9 other genocides. Every year they seem to recognize another one or more. Back when I started doing this research a few years ago, it was there were 5 recognized genocides. But the number keeps growing, and still there's no official recognition of genocide in a Canadian context, although we do recognize the Uyghur genocide, the genocide of Bosnian Muslims, and a variety of other genocides as well. These are just a few of the books that have come out recently looking at genocide in Canada, specifically related to the residential schools, but also to some other issues as well. So it is a growing, I guess you could say, academic industry. As people have more access to archives, survivors are more willing to perhaps talk about their stories now than they were maybe 1 or 2 decades ago. And so it's growing in importance. The issue of pluralism becomes important because there are problems with the UN definition. The UN Convention was created by countries, many of whom were committing different kinds of genocidal acts at the time. Canada patently refused to have cultural genocide put in as a key part of the Genocide Convention and threatened not to support the convention if we went ahead with cultural genocide. The convention also doesn't really do a good job of capturing the ways that Indigenous peoples comprise groups. In other words, their relationships with land, which are central to identity, their kin relations with other groups as well, which are very important, and the relations with animals, and like the buffalo, for example. So Cree theorist Tasha Hubbard looks at the relationship of buffalo and Cree people in terms of defining a group that has non-human persons within it as well. And we can come back to that as well. Another issue had to do with Lemkin himself, who basically didn't think that the U.S. Was capable of doing anything wrong. He saw in the post-war architecture after 1945 that he put this in a statement that genocide doesn't happen here in the U.S. and is not likely to happen. The role of big Western countries was not to admit they had done genocide and look at their history or ongoing legacies of such things, but rather to protect other countries, worse countries, from committing genocide against their people, and then also acting as a haven for survivors. And Lemkin's view of Canada was very much the same. So there's some elements of pluralism. I might not get into this. I worry it might get a little bit too academic, but there's various aspects to a sociological definition of genocide, which is sort of the cutting edge of where a lot of the scholarship is at the moment. What I will signal is that while genocide, as most of us would understand it, takes place during wartime, it's usually pretty fast. It's pretty violent. Lots of people are killed. There are clear perpetrators and clear victims. There's a clear beginning and a clear end. So the Holocaust is a classic example of the prototype of genocide. What these pluralist understandings of genocide develop is something different, that if you are in control of a territory as a perpetrator, you can afford to take your time. There might not be a clear beginning and a clear end. There doesn't need to be a necessarily stated intention. You can omit to do things which you know could damage groups and maybe cause their disappearance, but you don't have to make loud public speeches and necessarily write specific kinds of legislation that are specifically designed to destroy the group. That is a particular argument that comes out of this literature. So what we have in a Canadian case, and this was something we did at the Canadian Political Science Association. I'm on what's called the Reconciliation Committee of the CPSA. And we drafted, with the help of a number of Indigenous scholars, a list of different kinds of genocide that took place in the history of the colonization of Canada, and came up with a list of 14. It's on the Canadian Political Science website. And it's a non-exhaustive list, and that may seem like a lot, but there's more examples than just that. But these are just different types of genocide, which I've itemized a few of those here. But what this does for my particular field is it calls into question different ways that power is used in creating institutions that we take for granted, and then who controls what within those organizations and produces different sorts of outcomes. So those become very important to thinking about how genocide operates. Okay, now the Indian residential school system, do most of you know a good bit about it? You pretty well brushed up on it, would you say? Okay. Well, as we know, the roots of the system go back quite a long distance into history. The Mohawk Residential School was one of the earlier ones near Guelph, certainly. A system of residential schools was established by about the 1870s with the federal government and the four mainline Christian churches taking the primary role in setting up these schools. Unlike Pope Francis's apology, churches sometimes went ahead with the ball. They sometimes built schools, got students, and went after government funding later on. They certainly weren't indifferent, and they weren't just collaborators who joined later on all the time. and maybe we can have a chat about that as well. We know roughly the number of children who went through the number of schools, and we have a pretty good idea how many children died. This would be a lower figure for the number of deaths. Senator Sinclair has said it could be as many as 25,000 or even more than that, but it will be difficult to ascertain that. I went to the local cemetery of the Regina Industrial School over the weekend with my colleague Jim Daschuk, who wrote a book called Clearing the Plains a number of years ago. And so this whole cemetery, these bodies were basically found and documented, and Jim and his class actually worked to set up these markers. So we went and had a look at that over the weekend. And that's one of the newer sites that has been discovered, and by the settler public anyway, and is provoking a lot of debate and discussion in Regina about our responsibility as settlers to deal with all of this. That's just a map of the residential schools, which most of you will probably have seen. So there's different ways of looking at what we might call intent on the part of the state to commit genocide. And I'm not going to get too much into the details of that now because I can see I'm running a bit low on time, and I want to kind of move on, but I can revisit this later if you're interested. Why would we talk about genocide in the residential schools? One would be statements from different government officials and others who created reports, who drafted legislation, for example, that might hint at some sort of genocidal intent. In 1920, there was an amendment to the Indian Act which made school attendance compulsory for status Indigenous children under the Indian Act, and lay out certain provisions or sanctions for them if families didn't comply. We know a lot about what went on in the schools, obviously, through the work of the TRC. Things like forced conversion from Indigenous spiritual practices to one of the Christian faiths, name changing, the numbering of children, the erasure of language, and then, of course, very high levels of verbal, physical, and sexual abuse, which occurred in many of these schools, in all of the schools pretty much, leading to issues of intergenerational trauma, which continue to cause big problems today. And that becomes, I think, one of the subjects for memorialization. And then, of course, we have the TRC, which was operated from 2008 to 2015, delivered its report in 2015 in June. And I was lucky enough to be able to participate in a lot of the national events and to also go to that particular ceremony where they laid out the report and made a finding of cultural genocide. And that's what they said here, that the operation of the residential schools can be described as cultural genocide. Now, there's a lot of discussion about whether cultural genocide is real genocide or not. Like, the term cultural genocide doesn't violate the UN Convention. But what's important to understand, I think, about the TRC is that they had what's called a post-judicial mandate. Their mandate, they were not allowed to find that the Canadian government had committed any laws or broken any specific laws, including genocide. Now, this is what I had heard from TRC staff. So when I interviewed Senator Sinclair a few years ago, I specifically asked him this question, and this is what he told me. And he said, I had written a section for the report in which I very clearly called it genocide. Then I submitted that to the legal team, and I said, can I say this, or can we say this? And the answer came back unanimously, no. We can't as per our mandate, because we can't make a finding of culpability, and that's very clear. So we did the next best thing. And so that's kind of, I think puts it into perspective precisely what former Senator Sinclair was trying to do, but was not able to do fully due to the mandate of the commission. I also chatted with Marie Wilson as well, one of the commissioners, who said this: survivors who came forward to us talked about it and qualified their own experiences as genocide. They didn't qualify it as cultural genocide. They used the term genocide, and we heard that. I think we actually heard that referenced in pretty well every region of the country. And So again, this was on the minds of survivors, many survivors. No, I don't know about all survivors, but many of them. And certainly during the national and regional events, the term came up a great deal. And again, largely, and Senator Sinclair's view was that it was a violation of 2E of the Genocide Convention. We then have the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which didn't have a post-judicial mandate. They didn't have to pull punches. They called it genocide throughout. And then they also produced a special 46-page genocide report, which was specifically about how the murder of Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ 2S plus people constituted genocide. They mixed the legal and pluralist terms together to try to redefine genocide in ways which better reflected the history of Canada and the experiences of Indigenous peoples. And royal commissions can do that. They have a certain amount of power to actually nudge things forward in a legal sense in a way that other kinds of commissions can't do. So they talk here about a race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples, which especially targets, has a special gender dimension to it. Okay, and then we have interesting things going on in Canada, but nowhere else in the world. Justin Trudeau in 2015 accepts the report of the TRC. In other words, he accepts that cultural genocide took place in Canada. And then at the National Inquiry in 2019, he accepts that ongoing genocide is taking place in Canada. Now, what happens about that? Very, very little actually seems to happen. And it hasn't really impacted, maybe impacted public consciousness, but not really any kind of legislation or any kind of political changes to reflect those kinds of quite stark admissions by a sitting head of government. We do have a couple of bills which find their way to Parliament. So Liberal MP Robert Falcon-Ouellet in 2016 introduces a bill to have the residential schools recognized as genocide. It doesn't get very far. Indigenous MP, NDP MP Leah Gazan introduces a non-binding motion to have the residential schools recognized as genocide, and that happens last year around in the summer. And that also doesn't quite get enough votes to pass. What we're also seeing is a bit of a change in the way museums and other institutions operate. For example, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights had long tried to stay away from this debate about genocide in Canada. Karine Duhamel, who was the Indigenous curator for the museum from about 2018 to 2019 onwards, began inserting captions into many of the different displays in the museum. So I went around with her as some research for the book. We had lunch together, and we went through the museum, and she showed me the different changes that she'd made. And one of them here you can see, the TRC is just the beginning of the reconciliation process. Recognition that Canada enacted genocidal policies against Indigenous peoples is essential to moving forward. And so that has now become an official line of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, something which under the former CEO Stuart Murray and others was simply not going to be possible. And then I mentioned our own professional body, the Reconciliation Committee of that body recognized genocide last year. Earlier on, there was the Canadian Historians Association, and they essentially did the same thing. They passed a resolution through their membership in June last year, which says that this history, the history of our country, fully warrants our use of the word genocide. Now, I've got a few minutes left, and I want to talk about a couple of other things that relate to this, and maybe these will help spur some questions and discussion. I've also got a falling statute I've written on the statute debate. Happy to chat about that as well. There's different kinds of denial of things that have happened. There's a whole literature on genocide denial. I'm not saying people that say that this doesn't look like genocide to them are denying genocide, but we can use a kind of a framework to make sense of why people might be reluctant to use the term. And some of you may have a lot more reasons why you may or may not think that this looks like genocide to you, and I'll be happy to chat with you about that too. So Robert Joseph has this kind of a taxonomy of denial, and he has a number of different types which he looks at. And I have no idea where I am in terms of these notes. Interpretive denial has to do with not actually denying the facts of anything. It has to do with putting a bit of a spin on them. And cultural denial has to do with this idea that, well, we're nice, aren't we? We're Canadians and we're nice. We're Canadian settlers. We're better than the Americans. We didn't have the transatlantic slave trade. We didn't have a civil war. We didn't have the Indian wars. We don't have the gang violence that the Americans have. So we're the nice side of North America. And so that becomes a kind of cultural denial if we look at it. Interpretive denial would be something like what historian Jim Miller and his colleague Donald Smith have written when they said that forced attendance at residential schools, limitations on mobility, so on and so forth, was to control Indigenous people but not to eradicate them. And to this, Miller adds, if Canada wanted to destroy them, it would not have devoted so much effort to try to turn them into Euro-Canadians. But of course, under the Convention, our attempts to turn Indigenous peoples into Euro-Canadians does in fact fall under the Genocide Convention. And so the cultural denial is more just about how nice we are. Paulette Regan, who wrote the Reconciliation volume, talks about this myth of Canada as a peacemaker rather than a warmonger, for example. And then, of course, we have Michael Myers, whose book Canada talks about Canada this way. Canada may not have put a man on the moon, but it's been awfully nice to the man on Earth. And perhaps that will be Canada's greatest legacy. And so on this day before the Memorial Day of the residential schools, we have to ask ourselves, okay, we have the Canadarm. We didn't put a man on the moon, but what if we're not as nice as we think? Then what is Canada if not a nice country? And so these are some of the questions that I think as political scientists we're trying to ask about, can we make sense of what genocide means, but also try to think about what this means about Canadian identity. Can we be guilty of genocide as a country, but also in some ways also be nice people? And these are questions which are a bit difficult to answer. I have a bit of a section which I'm not going to go over here, but looking at the ways that different people have tried to kind of downplay this issue of genocide. Jim Miller stands out as a particularly strong advocate of this view. Ronald Neetzen, a well-known academic at McGill, also kind of deconstructs the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in a particular way by saying the history of the TRC is unbalanced. It's too negative. Ken Coates and Payam Akavan, very similar kinds of views that we don't need to use this kind of language, that focusing on the negative aspects of the schools, as Coates puts it, leaves the country with a distorted view of Indigenous realities. And again, these are all kind of debating points. I talk about this in my book and in a way refute them, but also discuss why these types of critiques exist. Okay, I've got maybe no time left, I'm not sure, but let me just get into something else that I want to get into a little bit before we go. And that is that we have recognized as a country 9 genocides. And we continue to recognize more and more genocides as time goes on. Bills come before Parliament in front of provincial legislatures, and we recognize genocides. It's something that we do on a fairly routine basis. But there are some reasons why we do it, and I think they're nicely encapsulated by some pictures I took at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, but I'll just draw your attention to some points here. One is when the enemy is our enemy too, when we fought against the perpetrator, and so we share the same perpetrator in a sense. The perpetrator regime then becomes the opposite of what Canada and Canadian values represent. So we can recognize the genocide of a perpetrator who's unlike us, but we have a really hard time recognizing genocide if the perpetrator is like us. So if the British commit famines in Ireland, for example, we don't recognize that as being genocide, or the British famines in India, for example, or the French atrocities in Africa, or the Belgian atrocities in the Congo, for example. These are not genocides that we have recognized as a country, because these countries are our friends, they're our allies. The only exception would be Turkey, our NATO ally, and we've recognized the Armenian genocide. You see this in the Human Rights Museum, this one here, where Canada becomes a haven for the victims of genocide, never a country that would commit it. And so this is just one caption. More than 50 relatives did not make it to safety, but safety in Canada. We are the terminus point for people suffering from genocide. Or Canada Cares. Seeing Armenian eyes crying is understandable, but seeing the MPs crying, that was the most touching part of all. We're a good country. We care about the suffering of other people. And finally, Canada intervenes in the Holodomor and the Ukrainian famine genocide. And so that becomes an important part of the narrative of who we are as a society. So what are some of the solutions to this? For me, I think one of the big issues in terms of what I've talked about today is to actually try to have genocide recognized. And 2E, I think, is a good ground floor for proceeding forwards on that matter. I also think, and I've done a bit of work on this as well, is that 7 years after the 94 recommendations of the TRC, a very small number of them have actually been fulfilled. There was supposed to be a National Council on Reconciliation to monitor the calls for action. Money was set aside, but nothing, to my knowledge, has really been done. An interim or temporary council was set up, and then it just sort of seemed to disappear. So I don't get the sense that while the government is rhetorically committed to reconciliation, whatever that might actually mean, they're not really putting any kind of oversight into that process. There's a good website funded by the Assembly of First Nations called Indigenous Watchdog, which very systematically details how many calls to action have been fulfilled and how many not. One of the big calls of the TRC was to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and this is one of the calls that the government ably fulfilled. So Bill C-15 was passed, which will now require that federal legislation reflect the principles of UNDRIP. Now, in terms of how this is going to work out in practical nuts and bolts policy making, I don't know. But it is a good first step forward, and I think that that's probably one of the bigger calls to action that actually has been implemented. I think there's also the issue of land back to Indigenous peoples, which is something that's been discussed quite a bit in the media and elsewhere, and perhaps we'll have a little bit of a chat about that as well. So I think I'm out of time, but not really, because we're now going to have a dialogue and then we're going to have some questions. So I'm just going to stop the formal presentation, and thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you found this interesting and not too academic and scholarly, but I guess we'll find out. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And for the moderated discussion, I want Chief Mowat to come up and join with Dr. MacDonald. And once they figure out how to get their headsets on, which is more than just academic, you're working.
All right.
All right. I'll turn it over to you, Dave.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. Excellent, Doctor.
Oh, thank you.
Very good. I was making some notes as a chief, of course.
Yeah.
You know, I deal a great deal with a lot of information coming across my desk, and I on the genocide piece. I guess I'd like your reflection on what, as a leader in my community who deals with the on-the-ground, grassroots, day-to-day issues, what benefit would either cultural genocide or the term genocide do for a leader in my position at a First Nation?
Well, I think as a political scientist, genocide in Canada was largely about attacking Indigenous governments and governance and laws and decision-making processes and policies. all the kinds of things that you do probably every day. And that may have been done in a similar way before Confederation, or maybe in a very different way. But the term genocide, I think it's not just a cultural term, but it is a political term. It's a political attack on peoples and how they live and how they make decisions for their own people, for future generations. It's how they learn from previous generations and how they made decisions and implemented laws and passed that forward. And I think it's important, maybe the recognition of genocide, to say that there was nothing ever inferior about Indigenous governments and the way they operated. And if Indigenous governments are having problems with the federal government or provincial governments, it may well be the fault of those governments and not necessarily the Indigenous governments and the way that the Indian Act has helped formulate those governments. Now, that might just be all a bunch of talk, and you probably know all this stuff already, but I think it's important, certainly maybe for settlers like myself and others, to recognize that genocide is an attack on governments. And so if we have questions about the capacity of Indigenous governments to realize the kinds of goals they have for their communities, then there are reasons why there are those high transaction costs. And those are not the fault of Indigenous peoples, but they're built in, they're baked into the way that the system was designed by the settler state.
Okay, very good. Speaking of the Indian Act, that is what governs our community in Alderville First Nation. We are governed under the Indian Act. Not every community is in Canada, of course, but it has a very important and impactful legacy, undoubtedly. How do you see how the Indian Act, and I often use the term, and it's a term that I think that it was coined by John Tobias in his fascinating paper on the Plains Cree, on the course of power of the law. How do you see how the Indian Act has fed into genocide?
Well, I think, one of the big things is that and this is my understanding, is that the land is still held by the Crown, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, and 90% of our country is divided between provincial and federal Crown land, from which we derive some of our enormous wealth as a country. Mm-hmm. Our population isn't big. We're in the G7. We're doing well as a country economically, but a lot of that is because of Indigenous land. So I think the Indian Act and various mechanisms of the state ensure that Indigenous peoples, you don't have enough land. You don't have enough land to properly realize self-determination. And so more land and full control of that land is, I think, a good start to that. And I suppose there's elements of the Indian Act that people have normalized and must work in some way that you're used to, because there's lots of calls for getting rid of the Indian Act, but then it becomes hard to find some kind of plan that people would agree on that would replace it. And so I couldn't answer that specific question. But the issue of genocide, I think, partly has to do with land use, and it has to do with assuming control over land and then taking other bits of land away as well. I know when people talk about self-determination, the topic often comes up, oh, well, does that mean Indigenous peoples want to have their own independent states? And maybe in some cases that might be true, I don't know. But what's certainly true is other Indigenous scholars and others like James Anaya, who is the Special Rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples for the UN, said, and this will be true in Canada too, the settlers took a lot of the best land. So if Indigenous peoples want to self-determine, even create their own state, they're not going to do it on the kind of land that they had, which was an abundant land. There's a lot of writing about settler privilege and inherited wealth from settlers, things like footholds and cushions and windfalls. There's lots of academic terms that we use, but the reality is that Indigenous peoples had intergenerational inherited wealth. The wealth was the land, it was the language, it was the spiritual practices, it was the laws, it was everything. And so when we talk about settler privilege, it's privilege that we've taken, right? So I think that that becomes part of the conversation as well.
I'm a fortunate individual that I was a former student of Justice Sinclair at the University of Manitoba. And at that time, he was a sitting judge in Manitoba. He was the first Indigenous judge appointed to the bench in Manitoba. And at the time I was in his classes, he was the co-commissioner of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Winnipeg. And that inquiry was sparked by the police shooting of J.G. Harper. And it also exposed the violent murder of Helen Betty Osborne in the PAW, which went unspoken about for a decade at least. And there were things that Justice Sinclair could not tell us because he was still sitting on the inquiry. And then a few years later, I was waiting for a plane to go to Winnipeg, and I saw Justice Sinclair walking towards me. He was flying out as well. And we were talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at that time, and he was talking about they were also building a catalog of visual art, performing artists, and I got talking about some of the stuff I've written as a musician, and I told a story about how I wrote a song about the Leland Hotel Blues, and I still play it to this day. And he looked at me, he said, "The Leland Hotel." When I was a young boy and I'd have to go find my dad, I'd go to the Leland Hotel. And I'll never forget that. I just want to ask you what you think. He's a well-respected man. In fact, on October 11th, I'll be at his invocation as Chancellor of Queens. I've been invited, so I'm looking forward to seeing him again. What would be your interpretation of his experiences? Now, I don't know if you know him. I think you talked to him.
Yeah, I mean, I've had dinner with him one time and met him a few times, yeah.
How would you, just from your own personal viewpoint, how do you believe his experiences as an Indigenous person in Winnipeg and in southern Manitoba, and then having come through the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry and hearing about the violence in that inquiry, how do you think that may have colored his views in the TRC?
Well, I think he would have, and I mean, just because of things he said, I suppose I would try to paraphrase that. I mean, I think he saw a lot of very horrible things, a lot of horrible injustices happening to Indigenous peoples because they were Indigenous. I think he also sees or saw, and I would say this is true of the Caribbean and Indian communities and other communities, racialized communities in Canada, is that there's a certain amount of internalized colonialism and self-hatred that comes with maybe not being a white person. And that gets taken out on oneself or one's family and one's own community. Living in a society where you individually and collectively feel inferior, it's difficult. And I think that if you don't understand that there's a process that makes you feel inferior, then you internalize that shame, and that becomes highly destructive. And I recall a number of times when Justice Sinclair would address the audiences of the national events and other things, and he kept telling the survivors, it's not your fault. And I think, that going through all of the experiences that he had, I think maybe that was one of the most important lessons that he could pass on to people, is that, it's not your fault. Like, things that you have done and things that have happened to you are not because of who you are as an Indigenous person or as a person, but, there are larger forces that work, malignant forces, which have caused this situation. And I think being embedded in those systems probably helped him to understand them a great deal. But I would also say his Medewan spirituality probably played a key role in him being able to, I think, center himself and understand from a position of, outside of this Christian cosmology of good and evil and all that sort of thing. I think allowed him to get maybe better in touch with what he needed to do. Those would be my guesses. I mean,
Excellent.
Yeah.
Being a pro-treaty and being a treaty person myself, I just wanted to, I appreciate when people identify the treaty lands that they come from. And Treaty 4 is in Saskatchewan, in the heart of the plains. And I just wanted to get your view on how do you believe treaty can help to build stronger communities and get us, continue on the road of reconciliation.
Well, in Saskatchewan, there are books put out by the elders, by the office. We have an Office of the Treaty Commissioner, that we're all treaty people, that treaties are ongoing relationships, that there were 3 signatories to the treaty. There were Indigenous peoples, there was the Crown, and then there was the Creator, who oversaw the sacredness of the treaty and the ongoing relationships that come from that. And I think for me what's important is that we're all part of that treaty relationship. The relationship is ongoing. And so we need to continue to foster those positive relationships. And if those relationships don't exist, then we have to try to build them. I just helped organize a conference at the University of Regina last weekend with a Métis scholar, Emily Grafton, and she took us on a tour of the university. And the University of Regina doesn't allow smudging on campus without special permission, I think, from the fire warden. They won't hang the Métis flag inside, and it was a tremendous effort for them to hang a treaty flag as well, a Treaty 4 flag, in the university, and they won't hang it on the flagpoles outside. These are very basic things, but they just, on the part of a university, they show disrespect to Indigenous peoples, but also disrespect to the university as a treaty partner. And I think institutions and people that run institutions don't understand that they are in a relationship of treaty. It's not really an optional extra. They can ignore it, but they are in that relationship. And I think we have to just simply recognize the truth of that and see that as an opportunity to build communities.
I had a meeting yesterday morning with the local OPP detachment. And policing, of course, is a very serious issue in our communities. In First Nations communities, policing is not an essential service. And we take it for granted in municipalities where, there's the Ontario Police Act or what have you, but in our communities, policing is not an essential service. It's the relationship we have with the local detachment is simply a call for service, basically. But in my number of years now, I have seen quite a negative relationship between the local OPP and our community go from what was not very good 25 years ago to what is quite a positive, a much better relationship. And I just wanted to get your feeling on how the police and the institution of policing can assist in the road to reconciliation.
Oh, that's a good question too, yeah. I think one of the things that some of the police forces have done is to admit that there is structural racism within the force. To actually recognize that and say, no, you're not imagining it, this is a real problem, and what's more, we're going to try to do something about it. And so I think that's probably the first step in doing something about it. The New Zealand police as well had very similar problems and still do, but they've also admitted it, and they've had a commissioner who's tried to take active steps to clean that up at the national level. It also helps to recruit more Indigenous peoples into the force and make sure that they are comfortable and that they're able to, I suppose, embed their traditions and cultures and practices so that the institutional culture can change. So, and I've seen that work in New Zealand, and if it's working here, I think that's really good.
I take note of a number of authors' names that you, Don Smith is a friend of mine. He's a friend of mine. He's quite a comical character, actually.
I'm sure he is.
I met him in the University of Toronto Cafe one night. One day I was up at the E.G. Pratt Library doing some research, and I walked across to the cafe, and Don was there, and he had a little bit of mustard on his cheek, and he was wearing the same sweater that he had been wearing the last time I saw him a year before, and he's that kind of an individual. For the audience, and I get phone calls, especially in the wake of Kamloops last year, I was getting inundated with phone calls. I was getting letters from the Bishop in Peterborough, the Catholic Diocese in Peterborough. I was getting phone calls and letters from a lot of people, and just people in general, people who had a concern about what they could do. What can I do? and I say, well, the first thing is you phoned me. You phoned. That's first positive step. For our audience, what sources would you recommend that our audience might direct themselves to gain a better understanding of this part of Canadian history?
Well, I'd start with the free sources, which are the TRC reports. There are a number of them. The introductory one with the calls to action, I think, is a good place to start. It's not that long. The Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, you can read the executive summaries of that too. The TRC also put a compilation of survivor reflections, which is also good. There's a non-governmental organization called Facing History and Ourselves, and I played a bit of a role in a free PDF textbook that they produced as well. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it's Stolen Lives or something like that. And these are all free PDF resources which people can download and have a look at. There's also the Legacy of Hope Foundation, which has a website, and they have short kind of YouTube-like videos by survivors with transcripts. I think there's transcripts. I'm not sure now, but these are just a few of the different sources that you can access, I think, to get some basic information. But I think most libraries and museums are now much more up to speed on this. And I think if you go into your local library and you tell your local librarian, I'm interested in this topic. What have you got? What have you got? And they'll probably be happy to tell you. And if they don't really have anything, then your question will make them maybe order some books on the topic, and then have to read some of the library journals and Choice Magazine and stuff, and see what's available that's good. There's so many good survivor reflections as well. There's one by Ted Fontaine called Broken Circle, which is excellent, and many others.
Excellent. I just have one last few words. Tomorrow in Alderville, we will be hosting a walk on Highway 45 from the Alderville Health and Services Building up to the Alderville Community Center. Everyone is welcome. Please, by all means, come and walk with us. We took our first walk up the highway on May 31st last year out in the wake of Kamloops, and that is the best visible statement we can make. And I also want to just commend the town of Cobourg for, I saw the banner downstairs, and I took a picture of it because it's beautiful. And I know the mayor here, last year I was here in Cobourg for the event, and so I just want to commend Cobourg for doing what they're doing around this. Just quick, when is the march? Tomorrow at noon at Alderville First Nation, at the Alderville Health Services Building, and we walk up the Highway 45. We'll have an OPP escort and first responders escort. And so just quickly, how do you feel the municipalities are doing in regard to this issue?
I can't comment on here.
Yeah.
I think Guelph has done okay. I think we could probably do better. I know different Indigenous peoples who've worked with the Guelph Museum and others, and they haven't found the museum staff necessarily as receptive as they could be to change. I suppose I put it out that way. So I think the municipalities could probably do better, but I think they probably all need to ask, how can I do better? Right. And if their question is, how can I do better, and they give you a call, then they're going to get some good answers. But sometimes they don't think there's anything wrong, and they don't reach out to get answers, and that's where the problem starts.
Yeah, I find it to be kind of checkered in that.
Yeah. So I'm not, I think there's more work to be done in that space for sure.
Yeah. I just want to also say, before Paul puts the hook around my neck here, on November 28th in Alderville, the 200th anniversary of Treaty 27 1/4. The Rideau Purchase, 1819, it was, the confirmatory surrender was November 28th, 1822. And so I want to commemorate the 200 years of the Rideau Purchase, and that became 27 1/4 because of this confirmatory surrender in 1822. We will have some speakers, one of which will be Alan Corbier, who will read wampum for us
Oh, wow.
And that is going to be, I think, something that you might want to check out. The wampum belts and the early use of wampum was our early were the earliest constitutional documents that were employed, not only by our people, but by the British. The British employed wampum as well in its communications with our people. So November 28th, don't try to meet me there, beat me there.
Thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure to hear you exchange views and questions. But now it's time to go to our audience, because I'm certain that there are questions that need to be responded to. Nedra is with a microphone here. If you hold up your hand, she will come by and will answer as many questions as we can in the time allotted. Okay. So, any hands?
Don't be shy.
Here's one right down in front.
One in the front.
Hi.
Hello.
There's a lot of reading we can do and continue to do, but my background is I have a lot of friends in Poland, Ukraine, Germany, and we've all met together, and one thing they told me very clearly was in their schooling, elementary, high school, history of genocide didn't exist, and they're very upset about it now as adults. How do you see the elementary and high schools as truly making any real steps forward in bringing the real curriculum? Because I haven't seen many signs of it, and I've been a teacher as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. I don't know a lot about what's in primary and secondary school curricula. I've been a consultant on material for the School Board of Ontario looking at different Indigenous issues, but whether the recommendations and the material that I saw was ever put anywhere, I don't know. I think at the elementary school level, probably genocide with the big G is probably a bit heavy, but I think in places like where I'm from, Treaty 4, lots of stuff about the treaty and our obligations as treaty peoples, you know. Lots of stuff about relationships, but also the idea that there are different kinds of governments as well, different kinds of laws. I was raised in French immersion in Regina, so it was just all about how great French Canada was, and they were nicer to the Indigenous peoples than the British, and then that was about it. That was the end of it, right? So that was, yeah.
The lies. So I think it's time that elementary school, not talking about the horrors of genocide,
Yeah.
exactly, but the truth,
The truth, yeah.
because they have taught us the lies.
And that's, yeah.
Could you please use the microphone so everyone can hear your
Yeah.
question? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I can just repeat that. Yeah, you were saying that we're just being taught lies in elementary school and not the truth. And I mean, that needs to change. It fundamentally does need to change. And the same would be true of high school as well. I mean, there could be, you know, if we recognize genocide in the residential schools, we could do a unit in high school looking at all the genocides that Canada recognizes, including our own, right? We don't have to, and put what's happened here in a comparative perspective with what's happened in other places as well. But yeah, there's still a lot of lies. I mean, that Discover Canada document that Jason Kenney put together in 2012 for all newcomers, it's exactly the bloody same. I mean, I think a few words have been tinkered with. I mean, that was in the, I think one of the calls to action was to change that crazy immigration document, because it tells all newcomers. So my Trinidad family wants to come here. They learn that the Queen, I guess now the King, embodies the state. Every single symbol of Canada is non-Indigenous, and Indigenous peoples kind of came here from Asia a while ago. I mean, like, liberals, that's fine. You picked up a bad piece of work from Jason Kenney, but you had 7 years to fix it. And why not? Why haven't you done that? Like, that's, you know, every newcomer to this country is reading that book, and it's just simply historically inaccurate. So there's so many things that need to be cleaned up, and I do worry too that, you know, newcomers coming to Canada are not learning the true history either. They have to learn stuff that is untrue in order to become a citizen, and you know, these things are not hard to fix. I could sit there and you know, we could sit there and in a morning and probably clean it up. But I don't know, this is why I don't understand why the government isn't doing these things. It's not hard, but it does require a certain amount of political will, I think, to do those things.
And the First Nations in Ontario have had a difficult time with this provincial government insofar as curricula, elementary curricula.
Yeah. I think you were,
We saw
oh, no? Okay. Oh, and Dorothy too.
Anyone else there?
I just wanted to make a comment for an excellent resource for anyone who really would like to know more on this, the history of Canada from the Indigenous perspective. University of Alberta has a free online course. It covers like a big, broad overview, but covers the treaties, the history of Canada from when the explorers were first coming here, right through to the economic issues that brought more settlers over, and art and culture, and it just covers everything. And it is from their perspective, which is not what we were taught in school. It's a completely different perspective on how things evolve. So University of Alberta, Indigenous Canada is what it's called.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Well, I hope there's some more audience ones, but my question is the hesitancy on the part of the government to recognize both Robert Falcon-Ouellette's initiative as well as, I believe, Gazan was the...
Yeah, Leah Gazan, yeah.
And also relating that to the hesitation of the government with the Liberals in recognizing the Uyghurs when the rest of Parliament were proposing that against the Chinese, right? But it's all of Parliament, not just the government, that needs to do this. So why hasn't there been a recognition in Parliament?
That's a very good question, Dorothy, thanks. Probably the main reason is liability, you know. There will be armies of lawyers telling MPs and the Prime Minister and everybody else, if you admit to genocide in this way, you know, you're going to have to pay for it. And I think that's ultimately what people are scared of, I think. But Leah Gazan's motion was non-binding, so it could have been approved. My understanding is it came pretty close. So I think it's just one of those things where someone will have to just keep introducing a slightly amended version of the thing, and eventually I think it's eventually going to get picked up. And it may just be that it'll get introduced first in a provincial legislature or a territorial legislature, and then a couple more pick it up and it kind of goes from there. So I think it's going to happen. I just don't know how long. But I think there's a certain fear of admitting liability that certainly animates the bureaucratic class and lawyers who work with the government. And so there's that fear. I think that's one of the issues. And some of them may not think it's genocide too, but I think that fear of liability of I think that's probably one of the issues.
Nedra, any more questions?
Yeah.
Right here?
Yeah. And if there's people that don't agree with me, by all means ask a question too. I'm used to being challenged, and I don't mind it, and I think it's part of the truth to share your truth with everybody here if you have a different view of truth that you think we should know about. So.
She's Alderville and Hiawatha, and reserves.
Could the
Oh, so we
microphone
need
be
to-
brought here,
oh,
please?
So I get the microphone. Oh. Oh. Oh, okay.
I'm curious about the experience that Indigenous people have had in countries that were colonized by Britain.
Yes.
And my question is, Do you see the way that Indigenous people were treated in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, India, as being not a result of, but do you see a relationship between the way Britain has a class system headed by a monarch who's defender of the faith, the Christian faith? Do you see that as having caused Indigenous peoples to be treated so incredibly badly, so that they are not possessors of their land? Would you comment, please,
yeah.
on the class system and treatment?
In a word, yes, I do see a connection. There's a famous American Indian theorist, Vine Deloria Jr., who talked a lot about how Britain was colonized and kind of lost its indigenous roots, and also used to write a lot about how settlers or I suppose white men, as he would have called them at the time in the 60s, were bereft of a sense of spiritual significance and ties to land. And I think what happened in Britain was that various systems of alienating people from land, of introducing them into hierarchical systems, created the conditions whereby it looked pretty good for them to go to other parts of the world. I'm developing a whole academic theory that looks at this, but it's this idea of creating kind of rootless, abstract forms of identity. The British common law, the English language, Christianity. You can basically be a British Christian English speaker, reading the Times, eating Tate and Lyle's syrup, and any part of the globe from about the 1860s onwards. And I think that this portable, modular form of colonization, and because Britain uprooted its own people, it created the conditions for the creation of the concept of being a settler. Because why would someone from Britain want to leave their home? They do this because they have no land and because they see opportunities to be at home on someone else's home. And it's a very violent act dispossessing other people, but and this is fundamentally, I think, part of the problem of the way settler colonialism works in reconciliation, is that if you don't have those spiritual ties to land, and those are things that you don't have, you don't notice their absence in Indigenous peoples. You don't notice when they say, we don't have these things, you think, hey, I don't have those things either. What are you complaining about, right? And that becomes a big problem. And that starts out from Europe and the different systems that took people from their land and created these class systems and made people want to leave and displace somebody else, and not really necessarily knowing all of the significance of what they were doing. So,
Is there one last question?
We had this lady right here.
this lady here.
All right,
yeah.
very good.
Thank you. I'd just like to know if Alderville and Hiawatha reserves and other reserves throughout the province are working with the Métis Nation of Ontario and Region 7 Wapiti Métis councils on issues surrounding the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings and suggestions and things they are and aren't doing.
If I don't think you'd want to know what my answer is on that. I just sent some letters. I just sent a letter off to the Prime Minister and to Premier Ford today regarding, and I'll be very frank, regarding the 2017 agreements that were on the Ontario side regarding the Métis Nation of Ontario. We fought, the Williams Treaties First Nations fought for 26 years in court, and we went to trial in 2013 regarding the Williams Treaties. And what came out of that was an agreement that reaffirms our Section 35 constitutionally protected harvesting rights in our pre-Confederation treaty areas of Southern Ontario. 26 years it took to do that. In 2017, Premier Kathleen Wynne, with the stroke of a pen, signed agreements with the Métis Nation of Ontario that is recognizing a flawed history from the Anishinaabeg Nation and from the Chiefs of Ontario level and perspective. So it's a very, very contentious issue, and I have to say that the Chiefs of Ontario and the Anishinaabeg Nation do not agree with the agreements that the Ontario government and the Canadian government have entered into with the Métis Nation of Ontario. If you do not meet the Pauli test, then how can you claim Section 35 harvesting or Section 35 constitutionally protected rights? I point everybody to the Pauli test that went through to the Supreme Court of Canada. That's what I'll leave it there with, is Pauli, P-O-W-L-E-Y, the Pauli case of Ontario. And that went to the Supreme Court of Canada. And that will hopefully shed some light on where the Métis Nation of Ontario is situated in this province.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have everyone join us this evening, and in particular to hear Dr. David and Chief Dave talk about the issues. Before we close this evening, I want to say that if you find this sort of candy for the mind to challenge you, we've got an 8-part series coming up very shortly on borders and walls. And you're going to learn about physical walls, including such things as how to build your own dry stone wall, and as well figure out and learn about what the meaning of beyond the pale is in terms of anti-Semitic walls, immigration walls, and muralism. So I think you really will find this, again, fascinating. But looking a little further ahead, especially with the recent announcements about a potential Alzheimer's drug, I think you will be excited to come back with us in the spring when we give a multi-part series on the brain. So once again, challenging your mind. I would remind you once again that Furby House Books is downstairs, and Dr. David will be down there to sign those books if you wish. Anyway, thank you very much for your attendance tonight. It's been a pleasure hosting you. So drive safely and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.